easy to walk in and share a little time with you. If you don't mind, how many of you have a smartphone? Yeah, it's okay. I'm not even going to tell you to turn it off. Who knows? It might be more interesting than this. How many of you had a smartphone 15 years ago? 25 years ago? Those of us who were old enough in the 1930s. Okay, so that's the first lesson in the differences and similarities between the 1930s and today vis-a-vis anti-Semitism. All you have to do if you use the internet or a smartphone in any way, shape, or form, you can Google more pro- and anti-Semitic material than anyone had access to in the 1930s. That's just a Vorspeise. It's a little touch to recognize that all of us live in a totally different world than the 1930s. It doesn't mean there aren't commonalities, but a totally different world. So, several of you were kind enough to say, as the people were pouring in, excited to see me again. Several of you were kind enough to say, what in the world is the draw? And I modestly said, it couldn't be me. But part of the draw is this. Leonard Fein, Olav Shalom, one of the great Jewish teachers, activists, and so on, who died about a year ago or so, Leonard Fein once said that in 1979, when Israel and Egypt signed an historic peace treaty, the first Arab state to make peace with and recognize Israel, a few hundred people showed up on Boston Common for a rally celebrating it. But he went on, if the word came that some far removed, obscure Jewish cemetery in North Dakota had been vandalized, 5,000 people would have showed up on Boston Common to protest the great growing wave of anti-Semitism. So point two. Point two is we Jews, by and large, have greater or lesser, but always there, antennae trying to pick up the possibility of anti-Semitism. It's certainly understandable, for heaven's sake. I forgot to turn this on. It has all the answers. And I forgot to look at my watch, but I do have a watch. It means nothing, but I do. We Jews are always attuned, to a greater or lesser extent, to the potential for anti-Semitism. It is, as I put a word here that will have two meanings tonight, it is kind of hardwired into us by now. Even those Jews who have virtually no real Jewish identity of a positive sort still are concerned with and attuned to the possibility of anti-Semitism. Why? There's a piece of black humor from the Holocaust. Some of you may know this, and I apologize in advance because it isn't pretty. Someone asked that in the Holocaust, what was the difference between pessimists and optimists? And someone said, the pessimists went to America. You finish it for me. The optimists went to Auschwitz. Now, a people who has that kind of a story as part of its repertoire is always attuned to the potential for anti-Semitism. Others will say we're the most secure, established, and mainstream Jewish community in the history of the world, and in many ways we are. So those two pulls are always there. Now, what are the great differences between the 1930s and today? Here's a few. One, in the 1930s, nobody ever heard the word Holocaust, genocide, ethnic cleansing, concentration camp, death camp. The word Auschwitz may have been known to a few people, probably only in Polish. Those things were not part of the repertoire of the world and Western civilization. And that makes a huge difference. The world became aware after the Holocaust of the full, terrible potential of anti-Semitism, it made for real guilt. Churches began to review their teachings. I always think of one teaching, aside from the Vatican II statements on the Jews. I think of something that happened in the Presbyterian Church. They began to review their Sunday school materials, and they discovered that in the fourth grade, I think it was, the fourth grade curriculum, that there was a statement to the teachers that when they teach, it's very timely because this is right after Easter, that when they teach about the arrest of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, they should not make the Roman soldiers appear to be too bad, villainous, brutal, because we don't want the kids to dislike soldiers. The church began to look further and recognize that while they had a caveat against making the soldiers look brutal, because we didn't want kids to dislike the soldiers, there was no such warning about how you portrayed the Jews. And that was before Mel Gibson. And apparently he never noticed. Before the Holocaust, in Europe, if you talked about the Jewish problem or the Jewish question, it was seen as a legitimate concern, and it had to do, what do we do with the Jews? What do we do with the Jews went back for ages. When the French Revolution, with its slogan of liberty, equality, fraternity, or if you prefer restaurant French, liberté, égalité, fraternité, that's the most I know besides restaurant French, with its slogan of liberty, equality, fraternity, one of the questions that came up in France was, what do we do with the Jews? To their credit, they gave the Jews citizenship, not so willingly, but to be consistent. It took them until 1791. Before the Holocaust, generally, however, the Jewish problem was seen as a legitimate issue. Finally, or second, not only in the 1930s was there no Holocaust, there also was no Israel. Israel makes a huge difference. Jews were homeless people, strangers in a strange land, almost everywhere. Some places they had citizenship, others they did not. Some places it meant something, some places it meant less. But the fact was that Jews were seen as people who could be pushed from one place to another, the eternal exiles. When we use the term golus or galut, exile, it had real meaning. Today, Israel is part of the international community. There are issues, but it's part of an international community. What's more, it evokes admiration, sometimes for its strength, sometimes when it's an underdog, not so much lately. It also evokes criticism, but it exists, and it makes a powerful difference in who and what the Jew is. We still have problems. The left, and I will caution us that left and right are not, one is not good and the other bad with this issue. The left tends to dislike Israel because it is not an underdog, because it is colonialist, because it is an occupying power, would be the term that is used. And we see things that are outrageous. We see legitimate criticisms, yes, but we see things that are outrageous. At UCLA, some of you are familiar with it, a Jewish student was nominated for the Honor Council, and other students objected to her presence on the Honor Council because she was known to be an activist, pro-Israel activist, and that meant she was prejudiced. From the point of view of the left, of that kind of left, if you're a pro-Israel activist, you may be prejudiced. If you're pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel, you are simply speaking out for justice. The far right, don't have to say much about it. There's racism, neo-Nazism, all manner of groups on the far right who are anti-Jewish, as they are anti so many other things. The irony is when it comes to the existence of Israel, as someone pointed out. The anti-Semites used to say in the 30s, "We don't want you here. Go back where you came from." In 1948, the world made it official, and the Jews were back where they came from. Now, the statement is, "You shouldn't be there." So it's fair to say, where are we supposed to be? Not there, not here. Israel is the only nation, I'm saying nothing new, I'm just going to say it dramatically. Israel is the only nation which is expected to accept the idea that its very right to exist is debatable. That alone tells us that there is a new kind of anti-Semitism, and we'll deal with that, a new kind of anti-Semitism which masks itself often in anti-Israel rhetoric and anti-Israel actions, some of which are legitimate, some of which cross the line into anti-Semitism. And I've given you a printout, but we'll talk about Justice Minister Erwin Kotler's list of how you tell. The United Nations, which created Israel, is now a forum where almost any anti-Israel resolution can be passed unless it is vetoed in the Security Council, even by nations that are egregiously guilty of human rights violations. So Israel makes a difference, positive and negative. Positive and negative. One of the reasons Israel makes a negative in the sense of anti-Semitism is, I think, that in Europe, a number of people, they don't say much about it, but I think it's true, a number of people think if only Israel would go away, we would not be frightened of Islamic terrorism. That is the ultimate blaming the victim, but it's there, and we might as well know it. What about the social media? And what about the internet? Again, two prongs to them. On the one hand, social media and the internet means it's much harder for governments to control the message. Much harder. It would be much harder for even a Goebbels, the propaganda minister of Nazi Germany, to have done all he did without people being exposed to the idea that what he did was lies. The other side of the fence is, you want to write something on social media tonight, you want to tweet, you want to post, whatever else you do, you want to put something on there, and someone else will repeat it and retweet it, and it doesn't matter what you said, whether it's true, whether it's false, whether it's ridiculous, and we now are able much more selectively, this is not news to you, but in the context of anti-Semitism, we are now able much more selectively to choose who we listen to, who we read, what we see, and therefore what we think the truth is and what the world thinks. That's a big, big difference. If you were to Google the Jewish problem or Google Israel, Palestine, Zionism, you would find all manner of accusations against the Jews. A change for the better. Governments in Europe and elsewhere now denounce anti-Semitism. Can you imagine what it would have felt like for a group like us in 1937 or 35 or 38? What would it have been like if they could have heard the government of France, of Belgium, of the Netherlands, and so on and on and on, denouncing Nazism, denouncing anti-Semitism? But we know that in Europe in those days, it was very, very likely and often the case that a government which hated and feared Germany was perfectly ready to do Germany's work when it came to dealing with the Jewish question. We know it in Hungary, we know it in Romania, We know it in Poland, Lithuania, certainly so many places, that the only enemy of the Jew was not the German Nazi. The governments today now denounce officially what once was accepted as policy. A very big change, in both directions. Islamic terrorism. I frankly don't know the words to use. That's one of those cases where political correctness has not reached a stage of freezing the language. I don't know what to say, but we all know what I mean. Islamic terrorism makes a huge difference. Why? One. Jews are not the problem. By no stretch of the imagination can anyone really put out the news that it is Jews that crash airliners into buildings, that blow up schools, that produce suicide bombers, and the like. Unlike the 30s, and I don't say this with any relish. This is like, I guess I can say this, can't I? Because I got the microphone. Occasionally, Jews in the days around World War II and shortly thereafter said that we were spared some of the hatred that was spewed in America because it was aimed at black Americans. We didn't necessarily say it with relish, but we said it as an analysis of the situation, that we could have been worse off. We could have been the African Americans of America. In Europe today, and throughout the world in general, it's hard for anyone to suggest that if you just got rid of the Jews, the problems would be solved, because all you've got to do is turn on the evening news, pick up the morning paper, and you read about Al-Qaeda, ISIS, or IS, or whatever the name is today, the attack on the Kenyan Christian school. And by the way, Christians are under attack. They're not under attack because of laws being vetoed in Indiana, but they are under attack in places around the world where they are a minority in I shouldn't say fundamentalist, in an Islamic extremist majority. In any case, for us, the fact that we cannot possibly be labeled as the problem in the fears and violence of the world makes a difference, I think. It wasn't the case in the 30s. In the 30s, for some reason, not everybody, people were predisposed, and I'll get to predisposition, predisposed to accept the worst about the Jews, and the Jews being the worst. What similarities or common sources are there of the anti-Semitism of the 30s, the anti-Semitism of the 21st century? Well, for that, I have given you, and it's on your paper, I teach that there are 5 basic kinds of anti-Semitism, 4 of which are in themselves not that harmful, one of which is the dangerous one, but they actually are related to each other. The first one is folk anti-Semitism. Jews have horns. Jews are stingy. Jews are money grubbing. I Jewed him down. That's folk anti-Semitism. It's just around. It's been there for a long time. It kind of persists. Maybe fewer people think it now than once did, but it's kind of there. Quick story. I will not name this person because he was a saint in this community. Saint. And I don't say that word lightly. We were at a Ministers Association executive committee planning session once for the programs for the coming year. Memphis Ministers Association, a really fine group that has always been on the right side of the issues. And someone said, a man who was one of the great civil rights and other good cause leaders in this community, well, in December, we ought to have an upbeat program, because we Christians are celebrating the birth of our Savior, and the Jews are celebrating a good month for business. Now, that man That man didn't have an anti-Semitic bone in his body. I tell you, no, believe me, I would go to court, put my hand on the Bible, and attest to that. That was folk anti-Semitism. He didn't know it. And how did I do it? Actually, what I did was I looked over at him and said, "You didn't really say that, did you?" And that was all it took. Because what he was expressing was a reservoir of folk anti-Semitism, which in itself is harmless. I happen to have horns. No. I just wanted to see if you were listening. Religious anti-Semitism, well, for so many centuries, religious anti-Semitism was fairly clear. It was the Christian ire at the Jew for whatever reason. I happen to think that it was expressed, of course, as Christ killer. It was expressed in the idea that Jews were going to hell. It was expressed in the early church fathers as Jews were the children of the devil. The synagogue was the home of the devil. It was expressed in the Middle Ages in the blood libel and things like that. But I think one of the other problems was that Jews remained a kind of theological thorn in the side of Christianity. You live in Boston and you don't root for the Red Sox? Some of you will get that. In other words, he came to you. He fulfilled your prophecies. He was the person you were looking for, and you rejected him. Forget killed. You rejected him. That could only be an act of willful evil. And therefore, because you rejected God, God rejects you, and whatever we do to you, God approves. That was a historic position of Jews and Christians. Now that's changed dramatically. It's changed dramatically so that there's still some reservoir of religious anti-Semitism, but nothing like what it was. I don't believe that even those who call for America becoming officially a Christian nation necessarily are saying, oh, we don't like Jews. There's more to it than that. But there's another kind of religious anti-Semitism today, and that's Islamic. That's a whole new part. And that's one that is combined with violence, and that's a lot tougher, a whole lot tougher. A third one is cultural. Jews will never fit in. Actually, we've come to the point where we fit in so well that it's hard to tell Jews from anybody else. And if you ask for who are the ethnic groups in America, no one will ever say Jews. It'll be Asian American, African American, Hispanic American, Native American, et cetera, et cetera. Jews will never wind up in that. But there was a history of cultural anti-Semitism. The Jews will not fit in. Not so much of it anymore. Social anti-Semitism, not in my backyard. You can't belong to my club. You can't be part of my fraternity. We allow only a certain quota of Jews in our college because if we let too many Jewish guys from the 8th Avenue garment industry, 8th Avenue garment industry? 7th, what do I know? If we let too many Jews from 7th Avenue garment industry into our Ivy League law school, they'll practice law the way their fathers practiced shmatas. Never, I wouldn't say it was never said, it was said. So there was a social, not in my backyard. When Jeannie and I lived in Baltimore, it was just recovering from the fact that there were 3 communities up the middle of Baltimore, which there were no Jews who lived in those communities, and there were restrictive covenants in the homes in those 3 communities. Political anti-Semitism, the only one that's really dangerous, ultimately. It's not Mrs. Cohen, it's not Mr. Levy, it's not my next-door neighbor. Good people, my Moshe, my Moses. But the cancer on the body politic is the Jew. They own the media, the department stores, the banks. They're the ones who fill in the blank. If you're a communist, they invented capitalism. If you're a capitalist, they invented communism. The Jews are the cancer on the body politic, and you know what we have to do when there's a cancer, God forbid. There are those of us, there are those of you, there are those of us who are cancer survivors. And we are cancer survivors because of chemotherapy, which is using chemicals to kill a part of the body, or surgery to excise a part of the body, or radiation to shrink and destroy a part of the body. And that's what we have to do when there's a cancer on the body politic. And that was the Nazi approach, a cancer on the body politic. It happened to be racial, but it was ultimately the Jews are the problem. A couple of notes on that. I talked about the man who was unconscious of the anti-Semitic slur of the Jews will celebrate good business. The Paris shootings in January, I think it was. After the Paris shootings, David Brooks, my colleague who is going to be here by TV in a few weeks, yes? No, David Brooks, he doesn't refer to me as his colleague either. David Brooks, the resident conservative of the New York Times and a wonderfully insightful writer and a warmly involved Jew, David Brooks and the Pope both commented after the shootings in Paris that it brought to mind the need for greater sensitivity in dealing with other people's religion. Because, of course, Charlie Hebdo had done some very, very ugly things about Islam. But what they both missed was that the people who were killed at the kosher market were not killed because they did bad cartoons about Muhammad. They were killed only because they were Jews. And that's a very important distinction. And the reason that distinction is important is because it is too easy to fall into the acceptance that when Jews are killed in the course of these things, that's business as usual. How do I know that? Because God forbid, if there's a murder, and I say God forbid, so please understand I mean this with all my heart. God forbid if there's a murder in East Memphis, it makes a lot of news. If there's a killing of black on black in the ghetto, unconsciously it becomes business as usual. The killing of Jews in the course of Islamic terrorism can too easily become business as usual, and it becomes it all the more so, and here we're all part of this, when we hear, God forbid, of the abduction of a child, we feel better. We feel better if we hear that it was the non-custodial parent, rather than thinking that there's a predator and my child or grandchild might be next. When there's a shooting at the Kansas City JCC, one of the comments that was made often was, and the guy wasn't even Jewish. And nobody meant it as ugly. But then you wonder what the translation is, because words do have meaning. Well, if he had been Jewish, it would have been okay. At least the shooter would have gotten what he was aiming at. Maybe I'd rather the shooter, So those are things that are undercurrents of that business of the reservoir of seeing Jews as somehow targets, as somehow vulnerable in our society. I say things like that because one of the examples is the Presbyterian Church USA, which finally voted a resolution to boycott, divestment, and sanctions for Israel. Been long in coming. It finally came about this past summer. Most of them don't have an anti-Semitic bone in their body, but they were willing to apply standards to Israel that are totally unrelated to their standards for any other country. And when one of their leaders was asked, and when I was president of the CCAR, we were engaged in conversation with the Presbyterian USA in Louisville, which is where they're headquartered. One of the leaders said, well, you got to start somewhere. Well, when you say you got to start with somewhere, why don't you start with the Sudan? Why don't you start with places where people are killing each other massively? Why don't you start with state-sponsored terrorism? Why don't you start with that stuff? And at this point, I want to point to you, I won't go through them all, but I want to point out to you on your printout, which I can't find, the Canadian Justice Minister, he was, under the Liberals, Irwin Cotler, created a list of 8 criteria for when anti-Israel becomes anti-Semitic. Easily, publicly calling for the destruction of Israel, denying the Jewish people's right to self-determination, delegitimizing, Nazifying Israel. Suddenly, Israel is the new Nazis. That is clear that that's meant to evoke an anti-Jewish feeling. Israel is characterized as the perfidious enemy of Islam. That's their religious anti-Semitism. Israel is attributed a mix of evil qualities by salon intellectuals and Western elites, cultural. They call for restrictions against those trading with Israel, economic. They deny the Holocaust. They support racist terrorism against Israel. Most of all, singling out Israel and holding it accountable to standards that they do not apply to other countries. And you can see that. I teach my students at Rhodes that. I don't spend much time on it. It's not central to the course. I want them to recognize those few things. A country that is expected to participate in debate about whether it has a right to exist, and a country against whom standards are applied that are applied to no other country. We go on. Can anti-Semitism be contained? Probably not eradicated, may be contained. It's too deep and too pervasive to eradicate. I use the term reservoir, and I mentioned that I would use the term hardwired again. I think hardwired into Western civilization, there is a low-level reservoir of anti-Semitism. We are a people who has been, for one reason or another, committed to being different. And to the extent that we have been committed to being different, against many pressures to be the same, it turned out that we remained different. But in some ways, we weren't completely different. And for that, I want to point to you the Theodor Herzl passage from so many years ago, the late 1800s. I'm going to read it to you because pedagogically you never hand out something and expect people to listen to you. I'm going to read you the part. You can hear in this the plaintive, I think plaintive sound of Theodor Herzl, who was an assimilated, cultured, Western Jew who was reared in an atmosphere, born in Budapest, reared largely spent his adult years in Vienna, largely a part of those Jews who felt we have come to the promised land. We are part and parcel of the approach to a messianic age, the fatherhood of God, the brotherhood of man, and not the neighborhood of Boston, neighborhood of Vienna perhaps. And they believed that if they just participated in Western culture, now that the door has been opened, it would prove to be the end of the anti-Semitism of so long. And here's what he says, and it's, as I say, it's plaintive. It's not anger. It's not mournful. It's resigned to this is the way things are. He says, we have honestly endeavored everywhere to merge ourselves in the social life of surrounding communities and to preserve the faith of our fathers. We are not permitted to do so. In vain are we loyal patriots, our loyalty in some places running to extremes. In vain do we make the same sacrifices of life and property as our fellow citizens. In vain do we strive to increase the fame of our native land in science and art, or her wealth by trade and commerce. In countries where we have lived for centuries, we are still cried down as strangers, and often by those whose ancestors were not yet domiciled in the land where Jews had already had experience of suffering. The majority may decide which are the strangers. For this, as indeed every point which arises in the relations between nations, is a question of might. If we could only be left in peace, but I think we shall not be left in peace. That's a remarkable statement. We've done the best we could. We had people who were heroes, decorated veterans in Napoleon's army, and then they were questioned 10 years later in 1807 in France as to whether they were loyal to France. There were people who had lost limbs, sons, fathers, husbands in the army of France. And then outside the Dreyfus trial in Paris, the mobs were shouting death to the Jews in the very place where the Jews had first gotten citizenship. And Herzl says, it's always going to be there. And he writes this perhaps 50 years before the final solution. I said that we have to set aside our left-right orientation. The left and the right have a tendency to meet when they are extreme. One of the places they meet is anti-Semitism. For whatever it is, I don't know why, but they do. Does education and contact make a difference? I think it does, but I think we have to recognize something. Actual Jewish success, the fact that so many Jews are in college beyond the numbers of the normal population, the general population, the fact that Jews have been economically successful beyond the average population. Jews are known to be in banking in significant numbers, and the Jewish names are there. In Memphis, and I teach this in my class because I want my class to understand stuff, I tell them that when I came to Memphis, the 4 great department stores, you want to name them? Some of you are older. Goldsmiths, Lowensteins, Gerbers, Schoenbergs, Julius Lewis. All right. It's the 10 Commandments. There's no sense our denying. One of the things about it is there's no sense, we might as well embrace those things. There's no sense denying that, as I think it was Daniel Patrick Moynihan said in his role as a sociologist and political scientist before he was a senator, no group came to America more prepared than the Jews. In Europe, we lived in the cities. In Europe, where commerce was the lowest form, we were put into commerce. We dealt in banking, et cetera, et cetera. Education was one of our hallmarks, albeit a different kind of education in Europe, and suddenly we came to a country where you could go to the schools and rise through education. So we might as well embrace the fact that we are different. We have been very successful. Quick story. I have 3 minutes left in my time, in my head. That means 7. Years ago, I was speaking at Grambling College in Louisiana, and a young man there said to me, "Rabbi, tell us why Jews are so good at business." And I said to him, "I'm glad to, if you and I will understand that in a commercial society like America, being good in business is a virtue and it's not a fault." And then I said, in the old country in Europe, and I told him, where land and agriculture and army and this and that and the guilds, this was how to make your way. Jews weren't allowed in that. What we were in was money lending and commerce and things like that. I said, if you want to know why, we were trained by Christian Europe to be good at business in modern America. But I wanted him to understand, it's not a fault, it's a virtue. I think we have to do that. Embrace who we are. It's one of the reasons that after 1967 and the Six-Day War, which is kind of the watershed, we all got to be more visibly Jewish. Some people said it was more orthodox, some people said it was more traditional, some people said it was more mainstream. What it was embracing who we are, because we found out they didn't separate the sexes in the gas chamber after all. And that's nothing against those who separate the sexes in the synagogue. A quick story, because the hardwired. I know I have 3 more minutes, that's 7. A number of years ago, I got to hear a speech by Secretary of State George Shultz after he was secretary. This was at a United Jewish Appeal, a UJA General Assembly in San Francisco. It's a long time ago, maybe 1989, I think. Shultz, not Jewish, George Shultz told a story I'll never forget. He said, I was in Poland recently, and I was talking to someone who's a friend who's in the Polish government. And my friend said to me, I'm leaving the government, I'm going back to the university. And Schultz said to him, no, you shouldn't do that. They need you in the government here. And the man said, no, I'm going back. People are beginning to ask me if I'm Jewish. And Schultz went on and said, everyone knows he's Jewish. The fact that people are beginning to ask him if he's Jewish is for him a sign of a rising anti-Semitism. And then Schultz, this man who is not Jewish, who in fact at some points there was some concern about him becoming Secretary of State because he had such enormous business interests in the Arab states through, I can't remember the name of the company. Yeah, Bechtel. George Shultz said, so friends, if there is one Jew who wants to get out from behind the Iron Curtain, for God's sake, get him out. From a former Secretary of State, not Jewish. The hardwired. It doesn't mean danger. It doesn't mean go home tomorrow and look under the bed. But it means that it's a level, there will be a certain level we'll have to live with. What we hope is this. 1, nations, people, will understand what, I wrote it for you, what Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, the former chief rabbi of the United Kingdom, wrote. The hatred that starts with the Jews never ends there. If governments and people, societies recognize that, they will not be as quick to embrace the hatred of the Jews as some were in the 30s, believing that they could then take care of the fascists and of the Nazis after they had done that job. Finally, the whispered question that American Jews asked themselves after 1945, never out loud too much, but certainly the question was what? Can it happen here? Could it happen here? I'm old enough to remember the little level of fear that I think I sensed in my growing up with that, could it happen here? And my professor at HUC, Olav Shalom, Eugene Mahali, once posed that question in a lecture somewhere, and he said, can it happen here? Yes, but we have to live as though it won't. And I think that is a lesson that for the 21st century means we see it, we understand it, there's a level of it that's always going to be there, but the best strategy is to embrace who and what we are and live as though it won't. Thank you. Yeah, I'll be glad to take. Except that Jan's going to come here with the microphone, so people who have questions will be heard. Or as Dennis Prager says, questions, comments, or short speeches.
Why is it so prevalent in our colleges now?
That's a great question. Why is it so prevalent in our colleges? I think our colleges, partly the the 60s, 70s New Left became a large part of the faculty in many places, and they tended to be very anti-colonialist, very strong on the third world, and they set up the model that Israel is the Western colonial intruder into what would otherwise be a very pure and probably peace-loving Middle East. And I say that with all dripping sarcasm. I think that's part of it. And I think the other part is that, frankly, there's been a lot of Arab money poured into a lot of propaganda that we have not necessarily been real good at rebutting. And I'll give you one free from our Pesach Seder Haggadah that we use at our house. It notes that Israel is the Ethiopians. You may remember that the Ethiopian Jews were victims and in danger both from civil war and from famine. And in fact, in this very sanctuary, the community in Memphis pledged $180,000 to save, was it 18 Jewish families at $10,000 each or 10 at 18? I can't remember which. But there was a tremendous outpouring to bring the Ethiopian Jews to Israel. And our little Haggadah says, I got it somewhere, it's the only case in human history where white people took black people out of their homeland not to enslave them but to make them free. If we can deal with enough of those things, it's possible that we could avert to some extent the kind of mindless anti-Israel sentiment of the college campus. Now, I say mindless, that's different from anti-Israeli policies. Lots of us oppose Israeli policies, but we don't think they're the worst things that's in the world since cancer. Susie?
Whoops. Rabbi, the current issue of Atlantic Monthly magazine, and I don't know if you've seen it or not, the cover story by Jeffrey Goldberg is it time for the Jews to leave Europe? So my question to you is, knowing the history of European Jews and knowing that there are a little over 1 million there, should European Jews today be optimists or should they be pessimists?
I guess I've mentioned one of my professors and one of the great activists and teachers of our time, Leonard Fine and Jean Mahaly. So the third one I'm going to mention is the father of American Jewish history, Jacob Marcus. Dr. Marcus spoke here on numerous occasions, and Jacob Rader Marcus was the writer or the compiler of a number of books on history, wonderful books, mostly compendiums, anthologies, archive-type things. He wrote one book in which he actually came to a conclusion, was all about what he saw coming. Dr. Marcus, you're going to wonder, what does this have to do with? Dr. Marcus was ordained, I think, in 1923, and he went to Germany, as everybody did. If you want a PhD in those days and you were a rabbi, you went to Germany. And he went to Germany, and he got his PhD in Germany. And Dr. Marcus wrote a book in the 30s called The Rise and Destiny of the German Jew. And he talked about, I have a copy of it, he talked about the rise of Hitler and Nazism, but that the German Jews would survive this terrible plague. Well, in the theory they did in some ways, but of course they didn't really. And Dr. Marcus never wrote another book predicting what would happen. So the answer, Susie, is I don't know. I think this is one of those things where people, in a way, pays their money and takes their choice. And I think it all comes down to the question of when somebody feels unsafe enough, they ought to leave. And there I do know a story. One of the oldest members of my rabbinic colleagues, Rabbi Herman Schalman in Chicago, told the story once. We were at a group dinner, and Herman told the story that in the early days of the Nazis in Germany, he came home and he told his father that Professor so-and-so, a Jewish professor, had been beaten up on the street by Nazi thugs. And his father said, it's time to go. So maybe the Charlie Hebdo kosher market means it's time to go. Or the shooting at the Belgium Museum. Or the shooting in Copenhagen, where the Danish government, incidentally, had been asked for more protection and said they didn't want to alarm the public. Well, it alarms the public when people are shot, even Jews. So I don't really know. I do know it's hard to uproot. I've never looked down on those who didn't uproot because I don't know what it's like to leave home. That's the closest I can come. Yeah.
Hi, I can just speak loudly. Oh, thank you. You're quick.
Steve.
What is the seed of anti-Semitism? And along with that, almost in comment to your last answer, might it not be better if Jewish people come to grips with prejudice and sort of prove it wrong or resolve it? Two questions, really. Okay.
The second one's easier than the first, Steve. Second one's easier than the first because anti-Semitism, deep-seated anti-Semitism, I think, doesn't really respond to facts. I think it comes from other sources, and facts don't help. And some of the facts can be turned on their head. Jews are smart, is that good? Or Jews are smart, that's bad. Jews are good at business, is that good? Or Jews are good at business, is that bad? So I don't know that we can educate people. I shouldn't say that. A great number of people benefit from contact with Jews and from education about Judaism. God only knows. There will always be a hardcore whose minds have been made up from other sources than facts. And your first question was the seeds of anti-Semitism. It is so hard to know. It used to be easy to say, well, it came out of the birth of Christianity and the fact that we were the ones who rejected Christianity, etc. But there was a Roman named Appian who wrote a tractate against the Jews and was answered by Josephus, who wrote Contra Appian. And this is before the rise of Christianity. You can sort of pay your money and take your choice on that too. Though I'll tell you a quick story because I was more or less in the story business. Somebody once said, if you're a minister, you're in the notions business. But Patty Chayefsky wrote a TV drama many, many, many years ago, long before some of you were on cable. And Chayefsky's story, I think it starred Ernest Borgnine, was the bar mitzvah of Major Orlovsky. And Orlovsky was a major in the army, and he had no Jewish content to his life, rejected pretty much anything Jewish and so forth and so on, didn't want any part of it. And towards the end, somebody said, I don't remember much about the play, but I remember this. Somebody says to him, why don't you just convert? And he said, are you kidding? I wouldn't give them the satisfaction. Now, we understand Major Orlovsky in a lot of ways. He probably meant a little more. I don't want to be the end of the line. There is in me what is called das Pinteliyid, the little point of Jew that doesn't get, little spark that doesn't get quenched, whatever it is. But whatever it is, I think one of the answers is, why can't you people just disappear? And of course, you gave me such a wonderful segue to one of the things I didn't mention but is on your sheet. The question somebody asked, will Europe ever forgive the Jews for the Holocaust? And someone earlier had asked, will the Germans ever forgive us for Auschwitz? So sometimes, and if you think that's far-fetched, I know a lady who said to me, nice, good, fine person, who said to me, everywhere that Martin Luther King Jr. went, he brought violence. And I said, You know, it was the people that attacked him that did the violence. But she had heard it long enough that that was the truth. So if only you people would disappear, there wouldn't be any anti-Semitism. Tim? Jan's bringing you the microphone.
Yeah, hold on a second. Thank you.
Believe me, after years of being a rabbi, I never turned down a microphone.
I know I speak for everyone in the room thanking you, but I as everyone in this room,
Thank you.
we love this temple. We care for this temple. And to me, one of the most things that I feel is that everywhere I go, I hear how you and Micah and the leadership have made this temple, as well as Judaism, as well as Reform Judaism, such a wonderful part of Memphis, Tennessee. And I think experiences here are so much better than some communities because of your leadership. And I want to thank you for everything, and especially the pride of what this temple has meant to this Memphis community.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. That's high praise for this temple, by the way, is not a rabbi or two rabbis or three rabbis. 9 rabbis don't make a minyan. And much of it has been the work and the activities and the presence of people here in doing good things and being good neighbors. But I will mention something, Tim, and thank you so much. I always said I was privileged to be among the first generation of rabbis who could go out and talk to Christians about Judaism and be, I don't want to say honest, my predecessors were honest. I could tell them things about how we differ from them, which in the 1930s or 40s you couldn't tell them. And I've discovered over the years, and I think a big part of it is the transformation of our society. That's why Europe is different. In Europe, there are people who point to themselves as, we're the real Frenchmen, we're the real Germans. I mean, the real Americans? Have you seen them lately? When I was a kid, we used to be scared they'd scalp us, remember? Anyway. We, after the Holocaust, one of the offshoots, one of the byproducts of the Holocaust, in my opinion, was the fact that I could go to a Christian church or Christian group and explain to them what we think about sin and atonement and why we don't need vicarious atonement as they believe they must, and could say to them, so for us, it's not a question of whether Jesus was or wasn't the Messiah or the Savior. It's simply that it is a cure for a disease we don't believe anyone has. And I've never had anybody show me that they got angry at that. But I can tell you that I was privileged, being ordained in 1964, to be among the first generations. I'm sure Rabbi Wax was more free than Dr. Edelson and so on. May they rest in peace. But I was freer to teach Judaism as it is and expect that it would be respected as it is. And that's a great change. And it's one of the reasons that this is in no way the 30s in that sense. Last question. How many have we had? 4?
Excuse me. Susan, hold on a second.
Pesach, normally 4. Susan?
Hold on a second. I've been reading the commercial appeal. Whoops. Okay. I've read the commercial appeal my whole life. And I'm used to them printing an occasional anti-Israel, anti-Semitic op-ed or letter to the editor that are signed. A couple of weeks ago, they did an editorial that was very, very anti-Israel, and I took to be anti-Jewish, and they even said they were looking for a final solution to the Israel, the Israel two-state solution problem, but they were looking for a final solution. Is this something that we should be worried about coming into our community?
Well, first of all, I think using the word final solution to us,
That's what I was looking at my phone, just because I
Yeah.
have the editorial on my phone.
to us, the words final solution have a meaning, just as the word Holocaust. I think most of us get upset when the word Holocaust is tossed around every time, God forbid, 6 people die. So the final solution, I suspect, was an unfortunate choice of words. That they meant, actually, there is even, there is a term in the diplomatic negotiations over the years of to come to a final something, but it wasn't solution. I didn't read the editorial.
I can send it to you.
Okay, what was the gist of it, though? It's worth.
I'll send it to, in fact, I could send it to Jan, and then anybody who wants
Yeah.
it, she could send it.
We might not want to
to
send
you.
it out.
It was a couple of weeks ago.
Was it
It
around?
was after
Netanyahu's
Netanyahu
speech.
had been here,
Yeah.
but it was after he had been elected, and it was talking about how he was trying to interfere with American politics by coming and talking to our Congress, saying nothing about our, the people who went over there to try and defeat him, and just that Israel, that he said, the editorial blamed Netanyahu, that there's not peace in Israel, that there's no two-state solution.
Yeah. Well, that's been an easy thing to blame Netanyahu, and there are many Jews who certainly think that we were not well served by Netanyahu as prime minister. On the other hand, without getting into the Israel-Zionism and Palestinian issue, the tough question there is who's your partner on the other side, as we all know. And anybody who writes an editorial that says that Netanyahu is the obstacle, and by the way, he is an obstacle when you build new settlements that Israel doesn't need, or when you do things like that, you can expect that if you're going to be in your face, somebody else is going to be in your face too. So in that respect, and in any case, the big question there is who's the partner on the other side, who can deliver peace to Israel. And it may be that Netanyahu just doesn't make the noises. The left has a tendency to mistake nice noises for action. As long as I care, as long as I feel bad, something has happened. That's not necessarily true. So in that respect, Netanyahu is not the cause of the lack of a two-state solution by any means. And there was another, mixing into American politics. I can't defend that one. I think it's troubling. It has been very important that Israel always be a bipartisan issue, a bipartisan part of American politics. And I will close by telling you how far back I know that goes. The president of the Zionist organization at the time when Israel was founded as a state, the 1947-48, was Rabbi Abba Hillel Silver of the Temple in Cleveland, exactly. And Rabbi Silver was a giant in the Reform Rabbinate. He was a giant in the Zionist movement. In 1947, if there was anybody who had achieved sainthood in the Jewish community in America, it was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Jews believed in Roosevelt. Roosevelt was, in the shul where I grew up, Roosevelt's picture hung in the foyer. When Truman succeeded him, Roosevelt's picture, I guess, went down. I didn't see, and I never saw Eisenhower. He never showed up. But my point is that Jews were heavily Democrat in the 1940s, and they were Roosevelt lovers. And Abba Hillel Silver, the president of the Zionist organization and a Reform rabbi, and you couldn't get more Democrat than Reform rabbis, was a Republican. And one of the theories, which I don't know if it's true, was that, and he was very close with Senator Bob Taft from Ohio, who was Mr. Republican in those days. But one of the theories was that it wasn't a question that Abba Hillel Silver really cared about the Republican platform. He knew that Jews had to have a tie with the Republican Party. Is it true? I don't know. I never knew it. I talked to his son a few times. But the fact is that Netanyahu, I think, did muddied waters that could have been left more clear by appearing to identify himself with one American political party or allowing them to use him for that purpose. It could go either way. But I think in that respect, that's not anti-Semitic. That's one of many possible analyses of what happened when Netanyahu spoke to Congress at the invitation of the Speaker of the House. If I didn't answer that one, I did it just right. Everybody have a good rest of Pesach, and thank you for being here.